Okay, welcome back to the endocrine system. This is part 2. We're going to start talking about the endocrine glands. So first up is our pineal gland. So here in the human brain, you'll notice here's your cerebral cortex, cerebellum, pons, medulla. This is what pituitary is. The pineal gland is located here near the thalamus, also near the corpora quadrigemina. In non-avian, non-mammalian animals, the pineal gland has photoreceptors and is sometimes called the third eye. However, it doesn't have too much to do with photoreception because of how thick our skulls and brains are. In birds and in reptiles, their skulls are thin enough that the photoreceptors that are in their pineal gland allow them to set their biological clocks due to like sun up, sundown kind of thing. So think of your circadian rhythms, like your natural sleep, wake, hunger cycles. In us, it secretes melatonin. So it does have somewhat of a function as far as our biological clock. So you probably are familiar with melatonin as something that helps you fall asleep, right? Sometimes people who have insomnia may take some melatonin to help them fall asleep. So it's a natural gland that secretes melatonin for us. So again, its main function is to help regulate sort of our sleep-wake cycle through the secretion of melatonin. One of the major glands in our body is going to be the hypothalamus. It actually consists of several nuclei, and if you remember back to 201, your definition of a nucleus in the central nervous system is just a cluster of cells having a similar function. So really the hypothalamus is several of these clusters, all that have individually different functions and secreting slightly different hormones. In this rotating skull that you see here, you see that little red structure. So as it kind of spins back around, that red structure is right above the pituitary, and that's going to be important you'll see in a second, but the hypothalamus is going to release a number of hormones which then control that anterior pituitary. Based on its location in the brain, it is a major link between the nervous and endocrine systems, so you get a lot of input from the nervous system, and then the hypothalamus will then, again, release hormones and stimulate the anterior pituitary, which then sets off a cascade of various different events in the endocrine system. So parts that it receives input from, the cortex, right, the thinking part of your brain, the thalamus, which is a major integrating center, the limbic system, the part of your brain that's responsible for emotions, as well as internal organs. So if you remember, hypothalamus is one of your thirst sensors. It also helps set your body temperature. Okay, so as far as the hormones that it produces, you'll notice there's some common terms here, like releasing hormone on a lot of them. So you'll see thyrotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, so not just growth hormone releasing hormone, but also an inhibiting hormone, as well as vasopressin and oxytocin. So remember, vasopressin, the other term for that is antidiuretic hormone. So what we're going to see is that all of these top ones, not vasopressin, not oxytocin, but these other ones, are going to affect the anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary will then release something else, which then will affect an organ, or cause something else to release something, which, ultimately has an effect. We'll see that in a minute. So moving on to the pituitary gland, you would have seen this in lab. So you'll notice that in this image, so if you'll notice how the person is standing, this is anterior, this is posterior in the image. So this part is going to be the posterior pituitary. This part is anterior pituitary. And again, you'll notice the color difference here. Those two parts of the pituitary are developmentally from different portions of the body. So the anterior pituitary is developmentally is a portion of the roof of the mouth that pinches off and migrates to this location. Whereas the posterior pituitary is a continuation of the hypothalamus. And these are going to be the axons from the neurons whose cell bodies are in the hypothalamus that extend down into this posterior pituitary, and they're going to release their hormones here. Okay, so to be very clear, any hormone that the posterior pituitary produces, it's actually being produced in the hypothalamus, but released in the posterior pituitary. Okay, so let me just say that again. So any hormone that's coming from the posterior pituitary, it's actually being produced in the hypothalamus, but released in the posterior pituitary. Because again, cell bodies are here, they're producing the hormone, travels down the axons to here, and then being released into the bloodstream. All right, so again, we're going to see a number of flow charts showing the movement from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary to an organ. So you can see the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary is triggered by the release of hormones from the hypothalamus. So in other words, the hypothalamus is controlling the anterior pituitary. And then from the hormones from the anterior pituitary then go on to affect an organ. So, first one, gonadotropin releasing hormone, that's a GnRH, that's in the hypothalamus. That will cause the release of either luteinizing hormone or follicle stimulating hormone, or I should say both of them, from the anterior pituitary. So this line is anterior pituitary. Luteinizing hormone will then go on to affect either ovaries or testes, depending on what the individual has. And the way that, let's say the individual has ovaries, luteinizing hormone goes on to affect the ovaries and then stimulates estrogen and progesterone secretion. It'll trigger ovulation and the formation of something called the corpus luteum. So kind of keep that in mind. You're going to hear that again quite a bit when we get to reproductive system. In the case of follicle stimulating hormone, if the individual has ovaries, it's follicle stimulating, so it stimulates the formation of follicles as well as the stimulation of the formation of estrogen. Now, luteinizing hormone, if the individual has testes, then that stimulates interstitial cells in the testes to secrete testosterone. So you can kind of see in that sense, there's sort of this analogous function between ovaries and testes. So whereas in ovaries, it stimulates the release of estrogen and progesterone, in the case of testes, it's testosterone. Okay. Follicle stimulating hormone in the testes stimulates sperm production and testosterone secretion. Okay, so this also will stimulate testosterone secretion. In this case, it's not so much follicle formation that it's stimulating, but rather sperm production. All right, so hopefully this makes sense to you. So this gonadotropin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus, which then goes to the anterior pituitary, causing the secretion of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And depending on whether or not the individual has ovaries or testes, each one of these will have its individual effect. Now, CRH is corticotropin releasing hormone, and to a lesser extent, vasopressin also has a similar function, although it's not its main function, as we've talked about it already. It's vasopressin is mostly antidiuretic hormone, right? However, corticotropin releasing hormone will go on to stimulate the release of adrenocorticotropin hormone, as well as beta endorphin, and then melanocyte stimulating hormone. That's what MSH stands for, melanocyte stimulating hormone. And then each one of these will have a slightly different effect. Adrenocorticotropin hormone will act on the adrenal cortex, specifically the specific areas, the zona fasciculata of the adrenal cortex. Glucocorticoids, specifically cortisol in us predominantly, is going to be released from the zona fasciculata of the adrenal cortex. This cortisol will then go on to do these following things. So it'll increase protein catabolism, protein breakdown, right? Converts amino acids to glucose. It'll raise blood pressure. There's an anti-inflammatory effect of cortisol. It helps redirect the immune system. So cortisol tends to redirect the immune system from to the periphery, so to more superficial skin structures. And this is thought that if when cortisol is being released, it's one of your stress hormones, right? When that's being released because you're under a stressful situation, because again, you might be running away from something or fighting it off, you're more likely to get injured, like have it to get a cut on you. So where you want your immune system sort of redirected is more superficial to deal with any kind of potential infection that may occur. You don't worry so much about the viral at that moment because, well, you can worry about having a head cold later if you survive the attack, right? At that point, you want to make sure that you're not going to get like a separate infection from a cut that can go septic pretty quickly. I mean, back in the day before antibiotics, people used to die from very small little like cuts all the time. Cortisol also affects memory in an inverted U fashion. And when we say an inverted U, what we're talking about, let's see if I can draw this here, is basically something like that. That's an inverted U. So meaning that at very low, if you have very low levels of cortisol, like on this part of the curve, you're probably not stimulated enough to remember the events. There's some optimal amount of stimulation where you're, oh yeah, I'm going to remember this. And then if you're overstimulated, then you probably aren't able to focus on what's happening around you. So you probably are less likely to remember the specific details of that event. So that's what they call an inverted U. So again, there's at some level, the levels are either too low or too high for you to remember like distinct, bits of like what the event might have been. You might only remember like generalities, or you can't even necessarily focus enough to really pay attention to what's going on. And then there's some optimal level that really helps you focus and key in on what's going on around you. Beta endorphin, that's your body's natural opioid that gives you a euphoric feeling. And often, a lot of times, the things that cause us to go through this stress pathway also cause sort of a natural high. And that's how some people get like addicted to like, they're thrill seekers and stuff, because you get the endorphin rush with, I don't know, skydiving or whatever it might be. This is also like where like runners will say like after running for a certain amount of time, you get that runner's high because there's enough of a stress put on their bodies that they're now experiencing the release of enough beta endorphin that they get this, again, euphoric kind of feeling. Melanocyte stimulating hormone will stimulate melanocytes. So those are the melanocytes that you're familiar with, those cells in the skin that produce the darker pigmentation. And they will do exactly that. They stimulate the melanocytes to produce melanin in larger numbers. It's not particularly clear like what function it has other than that, because it's not like you get stressed out and all of a sudden your skin changes. You are not an octopus. So again, there's still some questions about exactly how this works, but they do know that if given in large amounts, it can cause some darkening of pigmentation. Okay, the next two are growth hormone releasing hormone and then growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Okay, so it is just exactly as the names imply. Growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone, both released from the hypothalamus, either cause the release of growth hormone or they will inhibit the release of growth hormone, right? Growth hormone releasing hormone obviously will cause the release of growth hormone. This will then act on different tissues in the body, such as the liver, your muscles, cartilage, bone. And in general, the way that it acts on these different body parts is by increasing cell division, cell growth. In order for cells to divide and grow, you need protein synthesis. In order to make proteins, you need to take in amino acids. It stimulates the breakdown of fats and redirects glucose to the brain, right? So basically, growth hormone, releasing hormone, stimulates growth in the body, okay? Growth hormone, inhibiting hormone will do the exact opposite. It basically slows down the growth. And sometimes, again, this is part of our checks and balances in the body, where some areas you want growth, maybe it'll slow down, growth, slow down. You'll get, depending on local stressors, you may see growth in regions of the body. So for example, if you're, a classic one would be like a professional arm wrestler or something. Like your one arm will probably get lots more stimulation, and then you have much more release of growth hormone, releasing hormone. You'll have greater growth in that one body area, right? Compared to, I guess, other parts of your body. You'll also see lots of growth hormone, releasing hormone being released during puberty. That's when people shoot up in size and height. And then its release slows down after puberty, right? For most individuals. Okay, the next one being released in the hypothalamus is thyrotropin releasing hormone. It basically is going to work on thyroid stimulating hormone in the anterior pituitary, or it will cause release of prolactin from the anterior pituitary. They have different functions. So thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the synthesis and secretion of thyroid hormones, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. Prolactin initiates and maintains milk secretion by mammary glands. So again, this releasing hormone from the hypothalamus can go on to stimulate either thyroid stimulating hormone or prolactin, which each one of those has a slightly different effect. Now, if we take a look at the posterior pituitary, so all of those that we just saw a moment ago were from the anterior pituitary. And again, you have to have something released from the hypothalamus to cause release of the thing from the anterior pituitary. Again, the posterior pituitary, the cell bodies of the neurons are in the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary is just the ends of the axons of those neurons, and they're releasing either oxytocin or vasopressin. Again, oxytocin is going to be the hormone that is causing the uterine contractions during the delivery of a baby. And then even after delivery, it can stimulate the contractions of the uterus. And there's what's called milk letdown or milk ejection from the breast. So whereas prolactin will stimulate milk development, it's oxytocin that then causes those smooth muscle contractions in the breast to release that milk for the baby. Oxytocin also has other effects. So outside of just pregnancy and basically baby nurturing, it also acts as a bonding hormone in humans. So between mom and child, as well as between other adults, like between parents or simply adults. So it's the bonding hormone in humans. Okay. Again, here's just a reminder of vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone. We've seen this. So high blood osmotic pressure, simply meaning that there's dehydration kind of situation. The osmoreceptors, those are going to be the receptors that are keying in on your hydration levels, will activate the cells in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, again, here you see the cell bodies. They're going to release antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin into the bloodstream, right? And then we know kidneys are going to retain more water, so we're going to decrease urine output. Some of the other things we did not talk about when we talked about the urinary system was that vasopressin will also target sweat glands and decrease perspiration, right? Because again, you're trying not to lose water. And then we did talk about this, it also causes vasoconstriction. Again, that idea of vasopressin is that it causes vasoconstriction. That'll all help increase blood pressure, because remember, right now our fluid levels are low, so by causing vasoconstriction, we're going to increase resistance, we're going to increase blood pressure. Then the negative feedback loop that you have is that there's low blood osmotic pressure, so you're now hydrated, basically is what it's saying. So that inhibits those receptors. The inhibition of osmoreceptors reduces or stops the secretion of antidiuretic hormone, right? If you're very well hydrated, you're not trying to retain more water, you're hydrated, so in which case you stop releasing this, kidneys will no longer retain water, they will lose it in urine, you start sweating again, and then basically have vasodilation occurring. All right, so I will stop there, and if you have any questions about this segment, please let me know.